The morning he left, he said I had nothing. He was right. He just didn't know what nothing looked like. I was 7 months pregnant, standing in my own kitchen, wearing a cardigan that cost $12, driving a 4-year-old car, living in a house with second-hand furniture and dated countertops, and a grocery list that said eggs, whole milk, prenatal vitamins. He looked at all of that, and he made his decision. He chose someone else, someone with ambition, someone who matched what he thought he deserved. He packed his things. He walked out the door. He told his colleagues I was content, that I lacked drive, that he needed more. And I let him believe every word of it. Because here is what Marcus Whitfield never understood about me. I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed. I was waiting for the exact moment when the truth would cost me nothing I wasn't already prepared to lose. That moment came. And when it did, his attorney called him, and his attorney told him to sit down. And Marcus asked him to repeat the numbers 3 times. $1.2 billion. I didn't build it overnight. I didn't win it. I didn't stumble into it. I inherited it from a woman who spent 40 years proving that the most powerful thing in a room is never the loudest thing. It is the most consistent thing, the thing that shows up every day without needing to be seen. He left me because he thought I was poor, and that was the most expensive mistake he ever made.
The voice came before the footsteps. And honestly, Claire, I'm not sure you even understand what this family needs. Claire set down her coffee mug, carefully, the way she did everything. She did not turn around right away. She stood at the kitchen counter for one full breath. She looked at the grocery list on the counter. Eggs, whole milk, prenatal vitamins. Then she turned. "Good morning, Diane," she said. Diane Whitfield stood in the kitchen doorway wearing her good coat, the camel-colored one with the brass buttons. She wore it on occasions she considered important. Apparently, an unannounced Tuesday morning visit qualified. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast and dish soap. The November light came in flat and gray through the window above the sink. It was the kind of light that made everything look a little older than it was. Claire was 38 years old, 7 months pregnant. She wore an oversized cardigan that had belonged to no one in particular. Her hair was pulled back. She had no makeup on. She looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like a woman with nothing. That was exactly what she intended. Diane's eyes did their usual work. They moved across the kitchen the way they always did when she visited. Cataloging, the dated countertops, the second-hand furniture visible through the doorway to the living room, the car in the driveway that was 4 years old and not a luxury model. She had been cataloging this house for 6 years. She had never once found what she was looking for. "Marcus works very hard," Diane said. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down without being invited. She folded her hands on the surface. A man like Marcus needs a partner who matches his ambitions. Claire reached for her coffee mug again. The coffee had gone cold, bitter, like everything else that morning. "Is Marcus here?" Claire asked. "He's at the office. I came on my own. I thought we could have an honest conversation." Honest. Right. Here's what Claire knew about Diane Whitfield. She grew up without money. She married into modest comfort. She had spent 40 years pretending neither of those things was true. She raised her son to believe that a woman's worth could be measured in square footage and a last name with the right sound. Here is what Claire knew about herself. She was raised differently. Her Aunt Ruth used to say, "The loudest thing in a room is never the most powerful thing in a room." Claire, remember that. She remembered. "I appreciate your concern," Claire said. "Claire." Diane leaned forward. Her voice softened in the way that was not actually soft. "My son deserves better." Better, that word, God, that word. Claire looked at her mother-in-law. She looked at the hands folded so carefully on her kitchen table. She looked at the coat, expensive, but worn in the shoulders. She took a slow, full breath. She did not say what she was thinking. She never said what she was thinking in this house. As she said, "I'll tell Marcus you stopped by." Diane left without finishing her thought. The door closed behind her with just a fraction too much force. Not a slam. Something more controlled than that. Something deliberate. Claire stood at the kitchen window. The backyard was brown and bare. The oak tree her neighbor had planted 3 summers ago was finally getting tall. She rested one hand on the side of the counter, and then, slowly, on her stomach. The baby moved, just once, a small, certain nudge. "I know," Claire said quietly. "I know." She picked up her phone, looked at it, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again, then unlocked it and opened her messages. She found the contact listed only as A. Crane. She typed one line. "We need to talk. This week." She sent it. Set the phone face down on the counter. She finished her cold coffee, standing up. This is the life Marcus Whitfield saw. A stay-at-home wife, modest, quiet, a little dull at parties, a woman who clipped coupons and drove a sensible car and didn't have strong opinions about wine. A woman who had not worked, as far as he knew, since they married 6 years ago. He married her because she seemed safe, uncomplicated. He married her because she did not challenge him. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was happening right now. 40 minutes across town, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus Whitfield was sitting across a glass table from a woman named Noelle Hartman. Noelle was 34. She developed luxury real estate. She wore her ambition the way other women wore perfume. You could detect it before she even entered the room. Marcus was looking at Noelle the way he used to look at Claire 6 years ago, before he decided Claire wasn't enough. 3 days after Diane's visit, a Saturday, Claire found the receipt in his jacket pocket. She was taking clothes to the dry cleaner, something she still did without being asked, because she was that kind of woman, or at least she had allowed him to believe she was. The receipt was from a restaurant downtown. Dinner for 2, a bottle of Bordeaux that cost more than their monthly electric bill. Marcus had never once taken Claire to that restaurant. She held the receipt between 2 fingers. The paper was soft and a little damp, the way things got in coat pockets. She read it once, then again, then she folded it very carefully and put it in the pocket of her own cardigan. She picked up the dry cleaning. She got in her sensible car. She drove to the cleaners, dropped off the clothes, and said thank you and have a good weekend to the woman behind the counter. Then she sat in the parking lot for 9 minutes. She did not cry. She was thinking, there is a difference. Okay, she said to herself, out loud, in the quiet car. Okay. The baby shifted under her ribs. The heat ran. Outside the parking lot, the town went about its Saturday. By the time Claire drove home, she had made 2 decisions. The first, she would not confront him yet. The second, she would call Arthur Crane on Monday morning. She parked in the driveway, sat for a moment. The house looked the same as it always did. Beige shutters, tidy front walk. The rosemary bush she had planted by the front steps 3 winters ago. It had survived every one of them. She got out, went inside, started dinner. Marcus came home at 6:30 and said the traffic was bad. "How was your day?" he asked, setting his bag down. "Fine," Claire said. "Yours?" "Long," he said. They ate chicken and roasted potatoes at the kitchen table. He checked his phone twice. She noticed. She said nothing. Later, when he was asleep, she lay on her side in the dark. The baby turned, slow and heavy. Something was about to break. She could feel it the way you felt weather changing. Not a sound, not a sight, just a shift in the pressure of the air. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. Here is the thing about Claire Whitfield that Marcus never fully understood. She was paying attention. Always. She had been paying attention since she was 9 years old. That was the year her parents died, within 14 months of each other. First her father, a quietly brilliant engineer, taken by a stroke. Then her mother, from a grief that doctors called pneumonia, but everyone in the family understood was something else entirely. After that, she went to live with her Aunt Ruth. Ruth Calloway did not look like money. That was intentional. Ruth wore sensible shoes and drove a truck that needed new shocks and kept her most important phone calls brief and private. She ran a small antique shop in a medium-sized town in Pennsylvania. She cooked Sunday dinners from scratch. She went to church and knew her neighbors' names and remembered birthdays. And every morning, at 6 in the morning, before the shop opened, Ruth sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and managed what was quietly, carefully, and absolutely a 9-figure portfolio. Real estate holdings in 4 states, private equity stakes, regional infrastructure investments built over 40 years. Why doesn't anyone know? Claire asked her once. She was 13. Ruth looked up from her legal pad. Because I never told them. Doesn't it bother you that they don't know? Sometimes? Ruth set down her pen. But I've learned something, Claire. The people who love you for your money don't actually love you. And the people who love you without knowing about it, well, that's the real thing. Claire had thought about that for a long time. She still thought about it. Ruth died 4 years ago. She left everything to Claire. The holdings, the accounts, the legal structures, the trust. Everything she had spent 30 years quietly teaching her niece to manage. Claire had not told Marcus. She was not sure exactly when she had decided not to tell him. It was not one moment. It was more like a slow accumulation of evidence. The way he talked about money, the way he talked about her lack of it, the way his eyes moved whenever they were at a party and a wealthier man walked in, the way he had never once, in 6 years, asked her what she dreamed about. He never asked because he assumed the answer was small. She let him assume. On a Monday morning, in November, 11 days after finding the restaurant receipt, Claire sat in the office of Arthur Crane. 7th floor, a building downtown. A building, incidentally, that her trust owned 40% of, though the nameplate in the lobby said nothing that would connect it to her. Arthur was 55, gray-templed. He had been her attorney for 9 years, ever since Ruth introduced them at a Sunday dinner with the particular intention of a woman who was making sure the right people knew each other. He was looking at Claire with the expression he saved for conversations like this one. "You want to begin the process," he said. "I want to understand my options," Claire said, "before anything becomes irreversible. The pregnancy complicates the timeline." "I know that. Depending on what you decide to disclose and when." "I know, Arthur." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary way. Traffic, pigeons, a courier on a bicycle threading between taxis. "The holdings are structured in ways that protect them entirely from the marriage," Arthur said. Ruth was thorough. "Your personal assets, the ones Marcus knows about, represent a fraction of 1% of your actual net worth." "I know." "He has no legal claim." "I know that too." "Then what do you need from me right now?" Claire looked at her coffee, then at Arthur. "I need to know that when the time comes, everything is in order. The accounts, the structures, the documentation." She paused. "I need to know I can leave cleanly, and that no one will be able to say I hid anything illegally. Because I didn't. I simply did not volunteer information to a man who would have used it against me." Arthur nodded slowly. He picked up his pen. I'll have a full review prepared by the end of the week. Thank you. She drove home through midday traffic. She stopped at the grocery store because they were out of eggs. She stood in the cereal aisle for a moment, not because she needed cereal, but because the aisle was quiet and cool and no one was watching her, and she could just stand there and be. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Working late tonight, don't wait up. She read it, put the phone in her pocket. She bought eggs and a bar of dark chocolate and a bunch of yellow tulips because they were $3, and they made her feel, briefly, like herself. At home, she put the tulips in a vase on the kitchen table. She made an omelet. She sat alone at the table in the late afternoon light and ate it slowly. The receipt was still in her cardigan pocket. The cardigan hung on the hook by the back door. She had not thrown it away. That night, she called Bev. Bev Stanton had been her best friend since they were roommates at 23. Bev was loud in the way that people who are always right sometimes are. Not cruel, just precise. She was an ER nurse. She had very little patience for nonsense and had been vocal over the years about her specific concerns regarding Marcus Whitfield. He's working late again, Claire said. A brief silence on the other end. Then, Claire? I know. No, actually, listen to me, Claire. How long has this been going on? I found something last week. What kind of something? A receipt. Dinner, expensive restaurant. I've never been there. Bev exhaled, not dramatically, the kind of exhale that happened when someone had been holding something in for a long time. Honey, she said, I've been biting my tongue for years. I know you have. I never liked him. I know that too, Bev. You deserve someone who looks at you like you matter. Claire was quiet. The kitchen was quiet. The tulips were very yellow in the evening light. I'm managing it, Claire said finally. Managing it, Bev repeated. What does that mean? It means I'm not acting until I'm ready to act. And I'm not ready yet. Are you okay? Claire thought about this. Actually thought about it. I think so, she said. I think I'm going to be. The baby? The baby is fine. She kicks in the evenings, very determined. She? Bev said softly. She, Claire confirmed. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. She pulled her laptop toward her, opened a browser, typed something into the search bar. Signs of emotional affair versus physical affair, she read. She read carefully, the way she read everything. Then she closed the laptop. He never loved me, she thought, quite suddenly and quite clearly. He loved the version of me that fit the story he was telling himself. She did not question the thought. It had the clean, certain feeling of something that had been true for a long time and had only just been put into words. I knew. I already knew. The signs were there the whole time. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. She went to bed at 9:30, lay on her left side, which the doctor recommended. Put one hand on her stomach. The baby was still. We're going to be okay, Claire told her. Both of us. She meant it. There are things people do when they are deciding how to survive. Claire Whitfield reorganized the kitchen pantry on a Friday night at 11:30. She lined up the canned goods by size. She moved the baking supplies to the lower shelf so she could reach them without stretching. She wiped down every shelf with a damp cloth that smelled like lemon. Marcus was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of her moving through it. She worked for an hour and a half. She did not think about the receipt. She thought about shelf paper and the fact that the rice container needed a new lid, and whether they had enough olive oil. These were the things that held a person together when the larger things were trying to come apart. When she finished, she stood back and looked at the pantry. It was perfectly organized. She felt, briefly, completely insane. Then she laughed, a small, surprised sound. In the empty kitchen, at 1 in the morning, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by alphabetized spices, Ruth, she said quietly, to the air, you would have had something to say about this. Her aunt's voice came back to her as clearly as if she were in the room. I would have said, the pantry will wait. Go to bed. I can't sleep. I know, but you need to try. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. She slid into bed without waking Marcus, which was not difficult because Marcus slept deeply and without visible guilt, which was a thing she had noticed and filed away. She stared at the ceiling. She was not angry yet. The anger was there. She could feel it the way you could feel a headache before it fully arrived. But it had not broken through yet. What she felt right now was something closer to sorrow. Not for herself, exactly, for the version of this marriage that was never real. For the years she had invested in something hollow. He never saw me, she thought. He saw a version of me he invented and found comfortable, and I let him. Because I was protecting something more important. She turned on her side, pulled the blanket up. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak tree. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. The following week had the quality of a dream that was almost normal. Claire attended her 32-week prenatal appointment. Dr. Hollis, calm and meticulous, pronounced both mother and baby healthy. She's well positioned, Dr. Hollis said, looking at the ultrasound screen. Head down, ready. She has opinions, Claire said. Dr. Hollis smiled. They all do. Marcus came to this appointment. He sat in the chair beside the exam table and held Claire's hand during the ultrasound and asked the right questions. His concern looked genuine. His hand on hers was warm. She watched him watching the screen. He was a man who was, in this moment, a good actor. Or perhaps, and this was the more complicated truth, he genuinely loved the idea of this baby. He loved the version of the story he had written. Devoted father, successful man, growing family. He just didn't love Claire enough to stay in it. She had begun to understand these two things could coexist. On the drive home, he said, we should figure out the nursery soon. I've started planning it, she said. You have? You didn't mention it? You were busy. A brief pause. I haven't been around enough lately. He said it to the windshield. I know that. It's okay, she said. No, I mean it. Once this project at work wraps up, Marcus, yeah, let's just get home. They got home. They made dinner together, pasta from a jar of sauce he liked. They watched television afterward. At 9 o'clock, he said he had emails to get through. She went upstairs and ran a bath and sat in it for 20 minutes with the water very warm and a candle on the edge of the tub that smelled like cedar. She sat very still. She thought, I could stay in this. People stay in things like this all the time. For the baby, for the house, for the life that looks like a life. Then she thought, no, I can't. She thought about Ruth. Ruth had been married once, briefly, to a man who had looked at her the way Marcus looked at Claire, or rather, the same way Marcus looked through Claire. Ruth had left in the second year. She had never explained exactly, but she had said once, years later, over Sunday coffee, I decided I would rather be alone and real than together and invisible. Claire got out of the bath, wrapped herself in the thick white robe, stood at the bathroom mirror. Her face was familiar, a little tired, a little clear. I'm not invisible, she thought. I only let him think I was. The evidence arrived, as Arthur would later describe it, in orderly installments. First the restaurant receipt, then a second credit card statement from a different month that she found when she was looking for their property tax documents. a card in Marcus's name, an account she had never been added to. She sat down on the floor of the home office, slowly, with the statement in her hands. The charges went back 9 months, 9 months. Restaurants, hotels, tickets for the symphony, a weekend gallery opening upstate, a wine tasting in the Finger Lakes that Marcus had told her was a work conference. A weekend in the Finger Lakes. The weekend she had called him 4 times, and each time he had picked up on the second ring, clear-voiced, and said he was just getting out of a meeting. Sweetheart. She sat on the office floor for 11 minutes. The treadmill belt was dusty. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead. She was not crying. She had not cried yet, and she was beginning to understand that she might not. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had already, somewhere in the back of herself, been grieving for a while. God, she thought. I already knew. I knew before the receipt. I knew before any of this. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. That was the worst part. Not his betrayal, her own patience with her own knowing. She photographed the statement with her phone, filed it, put the original back in the drawer in the same position. Then she went to the kitchen and washed her hands. She did not know why she washed her hands. It was something to do with them. She made tea. Chamomile. She stood at the window with the warm mug and watched the empty street outside. Tomorrow she would call Arthur again. Tonight she would sit with this. On a Thursday evening, 3 days after the credit card statement, Claire's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. She was not looking at Marcus's phone. She was not snooping. She was simply standing nearby when his screen activated with a notification from a contact saved as NR. Can't wait for Saturday. I already miss you. She read it once. The screen dimmed. She walked to the living room and sat down. The television was off. The room was full of the particular silence of a house that was waiting for something. She was not falling apart. She had passed the point where this information could make her fall apart. Each piece of evidence had arrived like a stone added to a scale that was already tipped. She had been tipping toward this for months. She was simply now fully tipped. I'm not crazy, she thought clearly. I know what I saw. I know what I've seen. All of it. She picked up her phone, texted Bev. I need coffee tomorrow. You free at 10? Bev responded in 30 seconds. I'll be there. She also texted Arthur. Timeline moving faster. Update me when you have the review. Then she did something she had not done yet in all of this. She went to her home office. She moved a box of old Christmas cards. She opened a filing cabinet. She retrieved a small locked box. Inside it, a secondary phone she kept charged and separate from her daily life. She opened the app for the Callaway Trust accounts. She scrolled through the summary. Buildings in 4 states. Infrastructure partnerships. A regional pharmaceutical distribution company that Ruth had acquired in 2004. A hotel group in the Mid-Atlantic. Solar energy leases across 3 rural counties. Technology investments quietly diversified. A charitable foundation operating under a name that would mean nothing to Marcus, even if he heard it. Total value, as of last quarter's audit, just over $1.2 billion. She looked at the number. She had looked at this number many times. It had never made her feel powerful exactly. What it made her feel was responsible, careful, accountable to Ruth's legacy, accountable to the people whose buildings and jobs connected to these holdings. What it made her feel tonight, for the first time, was free. Not because of what the money was, but because of what it meant. He will leave me because he thinks I'm poor, she thought, and that will be the most costly mistake he ever makes. She put the phone away, locked the box, went downstairs and made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the yellow tulips. She sat in the quiet and felt, underneath the grief and the anger and the exhaustion something else, something that felt a great deal like the future. 2 weeks later, at 34 weeks along, she was sitting across from her husband at the kitchen table when he said it. He had been building to it. She had felt it approaching the way you felt a thunderstorm. The pressure changes, the light shifts, the air smells like rain. Claire? He set down his fork. I need to tell you something. She folded her hands in her lap. She was completely still. I've been... He stopped. Started again. This isn't easy. She said nothing. I think I've been unhappy for a while. He was looking at the table, not at her. And I've been doing some thinking about what I want, about the future. And, she said, and I don't think this is working. He looked up now. His eyes were direct. This was the part he had rehearsed. I think we want different things. She listened to the refrigerator hum, to the clock, to the particular silence of a conversation that had been coming for a year. You're leaving me, she said, not a question. I think, yes, for someone else. His jaw tightened. That's not... Marcus. He stopped. Yes, he said, quietly. She nodded. Once, slow. You're 7 months pregnant, she said. I know that. And I'll be involved. I'll support. I'm not asking for reassurance. Her voice was calm, completely calm. I'm observing a fact. He was quiet. In R, she said. Noel, the real estate developer. His face went briefly blank, then carefully. How do you... Her name was on your phone. I wasn't looking, but I'm not blind. He said nothing. How long, she asked. The question hung in the air. She had been carrying it for 9 months. She was asking it now not because she needed to know, but because she wanted him to say it. She wanted him to hear himself say it. About a year, he said. The clock ticked. Tick, tock, tick. She nodded again. She stood up. Slowly, with the care of a woman 7 months along, she took her plate to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the drying rack. She turned back to face him. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight, she said. We can talk about next steps when I've had some time. He blinked. He had expected something else. Tears, perhaps, or rage. He expected the version of Claire he had invented. That's it, he said. She looked at him. For a long, steady moment. That's it, she said. She walked out of the kitchen. Behind her, she heard the refrigerator hum. She heard his chair scrape back. She heard him pick up his phone. She heard nothing else, because she was already at the top of the stairs, already in the guest room, already sitting on the edge of the bed in the quiet. She put one hand on her stomach. The baby turned once, slow and sure. I deserve better than this, Claire thought. I have always deserved better than this. She lay down, pulled the blanket to her chin. Downstairs, the refrigerator kept running. The clock kept ticking. She slept. The guest room smelled like cedar and something faintly floral. Claire put fresh sheets on the bed that first night at 11, moving slowly, folding the hospital corners the way Ruth had taught her. She plugged in the small lamp. She arranged her pillow. She placed her phone on the charger. Then she sat on the edge of the bed. The house was very quiet. She was thinking about a Tuesday morning 4 years ago when Ruth had called and said, I need you to come to Harrisburg. I want to show you some things. Claire had driven 3 hours. She had sat at Ruth's kitchen table while Ruth walked her, document by document, through 40 years of quietly assembled empire. Why are you telling me all this now? Claire had asked. Ruth had looked at her directly. Because I'm sick, and because you are the only person I trust with it. Aunt Ruth. Not yet. Listen first. Ruth had covered Claire's hand with her own. Everything I've built is for you. Not for the money, for the freedom. I want you to have choices, Claire. Real ones. Not the choices people say you have, the ones that depend on someone else's permission. She had cried then. Claire had held her aunt's hand at the kitchen table and cried for the first time in years. Sitting in the guest room now, at 11:30 at night, Claire thought, this is a choice. This exact moment. This is what Ruth was talking about. She did not cry. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them, picked up her phone, and sent one text to Arthur. He told me tonight. Begin the process. She lay down, pulled the blanket up. She was asleep by midnight. The next 3 weeks moved in a particular rhythm. Marcus was quiet around her, careful. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup on the counter for her, without being asked. He slept in the master bedroom. She slept in the guest room. They orbited each other through the house with a politeness that was almost more painful than a fight would have been. He had told his mother, apparently. Diane arrived on a Wednesday with the specific energy of someone who believed they were winning. She offered to help with the transition. She said things like, I'm sure you'll land on your feet, and you're still young enough to start over. Claire offered her tea, listened, nodded. She was thinking about the 4th floor conference room at one of the Trust's commercial properties across town, where Arthur and her financial team were quietly and methodically preparing documents. Diane, blessedly, did not know this. Have you thought about what you'll do? Diane asked. Financially, I mean. Marcus wants to be fair, of course. I'll be fine, Claire said simply. You haven't worked in years. It can be hard to... Diane. Claire set down her cup. Her voice was not unkind, but it was clear. I said, I'll be fine. Diane blinked. She was not accustomed to being interrupted. Of course, she said, after a moment. Of course you will. Bev came over on a Saturday and sat in the kitchen and said very little for the first 20 minutes. This was unusual for Bev. It was also, because of that, exactly right. Eventually she said, How are you actually doing? I'm okay, Claire said. I'm really okay. Which I know sounds suspicious. It sounds like you. Does it? You've always been the person who deals with things by getting very calm and very organized. Bev reached for her coffee. The question is whether the calm is real or if you're going to crash. Claire thought about this. I think the calm is real. I'm sad. I am actually sad, but I didn't lose myself in this. I think that's the difference. Because of Ruth? Because of Ruth. Because of what she left me. Not the money. Claire paused. The knowing. Knowing I have a foundation. Bev looked at her. She was the only person outside of Arthur who knew about the holdings. Ruth had told her herself at a birthday dinner 3 years ago, with the specific instinct of someone making sure the right people had the right information. Bev had never once mentioned it to Claire uninvited. She had simply sat with it, a quiet piece of knowledge, like a key kept safe for when it was needed. He doesn't know what he's walking away from, Bev said. No, Claire said. He really doesn't. A beat, then almost simultaneously, they both started to laugh. Not cruel laughter. The laughter of two women sitting in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee, with the particular, complicated, relieved humor of someone who could finally see the whole shape of a thing. Oh, Claire, Bev said, still laughing. When he finds out. I know, Claire said. The look on his face. I know. They laughed a little more, then quiet. The morning light was good. The tulips were fresh. The baby shifted under Claire's ribs with her characteristic, decisive nudge. She knows too, Claire said, looking down. Bev shook her head slowly. She's going to be something, that kid. She's going to be everything, Claire said. The divorce papers were served on a Thursday. Marcus had filed. He was not cruel about it. He was not a cruel man exactly, just a selfish and limited one. The papers proposed what he believed to be a fair split. The house, jointly owned, her car, a modest spousal support arrangement based on his understanding of their combined finances, which was to say, based on a gross and fundamental misunderstanding. Claire sat with the papers at the kitchen table. She read them once, completely. She had a good mind for documents. Ruth had trained her. She noted, carefully, where the numbers came from, what they represented, what was missing. Starting over at 38 felt impossible from where he was standing, she thought. But staying was never an option. Then she went upstairs and pulled her secondary phone from the locked box and called Arthur. "I have the petition," she said. "Yes, our response is ready." "What does the response look like?" "It looks," Arthur said, "like a correction of the record." "Good." "Claire," he paused, "when this becomes public, and it will, are you prepared for that?" She sat on the edge of the office chair. The afternoon light came through the window. The neighbor's oak tree had lost most of its leaves. The branches were bare and black against the gray sky. "I've been prepared for this since I was 13 years old," she said. Claire was 37 weeks along when the first real contraction stopped her mid-sentence. She was on the phone with Arthur, discussing the counter-filing timeline, standing in the kitchen when it happened. A tightening, deep. Not the Braxton Hicks she had become used to. Something more fundamental. She breathed through it. "Arthur," she said when it passed, "I need to call you back." She hung up, stood still. Another one came 14 minutes later. She was not afraid exactly. She was a woman who had spent months preparing for a great many things, and this was something she had also prepared for. She had Dr. Hollis's number memorized. She had her hospital bag by the door of the guest room. She had a list. She called the hospital. The nurse said, "How far apart are the contractions?" 14 minutes. "Water's broken?" "Not yet." "Come in when they're 8 to 10 minutes apart." She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the yellow tulips. They needed to be replaced soon. Marcus was not home. Marcus was, based on his last text, almost certainly not at the office. She did not call him yet. She would call him when the time was right, because he should be there. But she did not need him to begin with. She called Bev. "Come," she said. Bev arrived in 22 minutes. She did not panic. She was an ER nurse. Panic, for Bev, had been surgically removed. "How far apart?" she said, coming through the door with a bag of her own. "Now about 11. Getting closer." Bev felt her forehead, took her pulse, looked at her the way healthcare workers look at people. Full inventory, very fast. "You're doing great," she said. "I know," Claire said. Bev actually laughed. "Only you." They sat in the kitchen together. While the contractions came, Bev timed them. Claire breathed through each one, gripping the edge of the table, then releasing. Between contractions, she was composed. She drank water with lemon. She asked Bev about her week. "You're making small talk during early labor," Bev said. "What else should I be doing? Most people panic. Panicking won't help the baby." At 7:30, the contractions were 9 minutes apart. Bev called ahead to the hospital. Then she picked up Claire's bag. "Should I call Marcus?" Bev asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Call him." Marcus arrived at the hospital 1 hour and 40 minutes after Claire. He had the look of a man who had been somewhere he could not name and had driven very fast to correct the fact of it. His collar was slightly off. He was holding a coffee he had grabbed somewhere and had not drunk. Claire was already in a bed, already further along than he expected. Bev was beside her. The room was calm. He took Claire's hand. She let him. This was not a moment of warmth between them, not a restoration, not a softening. It was simply this: a man being present at the birth of his child, because that was what was right, and a woman who had made room for that rightness even while the marriage was already, technically, over. Labor took 11 more hours. It was not easy. None of it was easy. The contractions came faster, and the pain became specific and enormous. Claire breathed and gripped the rails and breathed again. She did not make drama of it. She was the kind of person who contained things, who processed internally, who saved the falling apart for later. But at 2:17 in the morning, somewhere in the 6th hour, she turned her face toward the window. Marcus was in the chair in the corner, dozing. Bev was beside her, steady, quiet. The night was very black outside the window. Claire closed her eyes. She was thinking of Ruth, the kitchen in Harrisburg, the yellow legal pad, the sound of Ruth's pen on paper in the early morning quiet. She was thinking, this is the last hard night that belongs to the old life. The next one is mine. The pain came again. She breathed. Bev took her hand. You're almost there, Bev said softly. I know, Claire said. At 4:51 in the morning, a girl was born. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair. She announced herself with one clear, astonishing cry, and then went quiet and looked around the room with an expression of focused attention. Dr. Hollis said softly, Hello, Miss Personality. Claire held her. For the first time in 9 months, she cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, from something she didn't have a word for exactly. A cracking open, a fullness, a recognition that the thing she had been protecting and building toward all this time was in her arms and was small and real and entirely here. Hi, she said to her daughter. Hi, you. Marcus stood at the edge of the bed. He was looking at his daughter with an expression that was, Claire would grant him, entirely genuine. Whatever else he had done, this was real. What's her name? He asked. Rosemary, Claire said. He nodded. Like the plant by the front door. Like the plant. He reached out and touched his daughter's hand, very carefully, the way you touched something fragile and precious. Then he stepped back, and Claire held Rosemary. The room was full of the blue-gray light of a very early morning. Somewhere in the building, a machine beeped. Somewhere far below, a car moved through the empty street. The world was going on exactly as it always had. And everything, quietly and permanently, was different. She was home 4 days later. Marcus helped with logistics. He was efficient and present in the ways that mattered practically. He was absent in the ways that mattered personally. This was actually the ideal configuration for where they currently were. He moved his remaining things out on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Rosemary was born. Claire sat in the armchair in the living room, nursing the baby, while the sounds of packing moved through the upstairs rooms. Boxes dragged across hardwood. Closet doors opened and closed. Drawers pulled out and pushed back in. She sat and nursed Rosemary and looked at the morning light on the living room floor. When Marcus came downstairs with the last box, he paused in the doorway. I want to be a good father, he said. I know you do, Claire said. I think you can be. He nodded. He looked at Rosemary. She had her eyes open, looking up at Claire with the ancient, focused expression of someone learning what faces were for. I'll call about visitation, he said. Arthur has the schedule proposal. A pause. He registered the name. Right. He left. She heard the car back out of the driveway. She heard it reach the end of the street and turn, and then the sound of the engine faded until there was nothing. She looked down at Rosemary. Just us now, Claire said. For a little while, just us. Rosemary blinked. In the weeks that followed, Claire learned some things about herself that she had known in theory, but was only now learning in practice. She learned that she was actually good at being alone, not in the grim way of someone making do, in the genuine way of someone who had always done her best thinking in quiet. The house, now that it was only hers, felt different. Not emptier, more itself. She rearranged 2 pieces of furniture that had never been in the right places. She replaced the bedroom curtains with ones she actually liked. She put Ruth's photograph on the kitchen windowsill, where it had always belonged. Small things. But they were hers. She also learned that Rosemary had opinions from the beginning. Rosemary had opinions about the angle at which she was held, about the specific frequency of the white noise machine, about whether her bath was exactly warm enough, which it needed to be, and exactly not too warm, which it also needed to be. She communicated these opinions with absolute precision, which Claire found, despite the exhaustion, deeply funny. "You have your great aunt's temperament," Claire told her, at 3 in the morning, in the rocking chair in the nursery that Claire had finished herself. "She would have liked you very much." The nursery smelled like the cedar blocks Claire had put in the closet, and the lavender lotion she used after Rosemary's baths. The light was the small amber lamp in the corner. Outside, the January night was very cold and very quiet. Claire sat in the rocking chair and nursed her daughter and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became invisible. I let that happen. I thought it was protecting something, and maybe it was, but I'm done being invisible now. Starting over at 38. The phrase kept arriving in her mind. Marcus's attorney had used it in a document. Diane had used it in conversation. The whole world around her seemed to have agreed that this was what she was doing. Starting over. But that wasn't right. That wasn't what this was. She wasn't starting over. She was starting out. For the first time, without hiding. Meanwhile, on the other side of the town, Marcus had made a significant social error. He had told his colleagues that he was leaving his wife. "We just wanted different things," he had said, with the practiced ease of a man who had had time to refine the story. "She's great, but she's very content. You know, I need someone with more drive." Noelle was with him at a dinner party at his colleague's house. She was polished and confident and laughed at the right moments. Marcus watched her work the room and felt, briefly, like he had made a good decision. A woman named Sandra, whose husband worked in private equity and whose dinner parties featured 12-person tables and very good wine, asked about the separation. "She'll be fine," Marcus said. "She doesn't have a career or anything. We'll work something out." "What did she do before you married?" He considered. "I think she worked at her aunt's shop. Antiques, something like that. She stopped when we got married." He shrugged. She was never really that ambitious. Sandra made a sympathetic sound. Filed this information away. She did not say, because she didn't know yet, that she had once seen a reference to something called the Callaway Trust in a financial publication, and that the name had nagged at her. That sometime in the next few weeks, she would make a connection that Marcus Whitfield would very much wish she hadn't. The moment that changed everything publicly arrived on a gray February morning. Arthur filed Claire's full financial disclosure. He had told her this was required by law. He had also told her, very calmly, and with the slightest shadow of professional satisfaction, that it was going to be significant. It was, by any measure, a remarkable document. Marcus's attorney called Arthur within 2 hours of receiving it. Arthur told Claire about the call that afternoon. He sat across from her in the 4th-floor conference room, the one with the good light and the view of the city, and he described it with the measured precision of a man who was very much enjoying himself while appearing not to be. He said, "What exactly is this?" Arthur told her. "And you said?" Claire asked. "I said it was exactly what it said it was, a complete and accurate financial disclosure from my client." And then there was the silence, Arthur said, that I would describe as one of the more satisfying silences of my career. Claire looked at her coffee. "He had no idea," she said, not a question. "He had absolutely no idea," Arthur confirmed. "The proposed settlement, the one where he was planning to be so very fair to you, he's going to need to file an amendment." She nodded. There's one more thing, Arthur said. His client called him directly this afternoon, before I spoke with you. Marcus called his own attorney? He asked his attorney to repeat the numbers 3 times. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to hear what he says when he calls me. He'll call, Arthur said. Probably tonight. He called at 9:15. She was in the nursery, settling Rosemary. She heard her phone buzz on the dresser. She looked at the screen, set Rosemary in the crib, walked to the hall, answered. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus said. It was not quite a question. She had thought about how to answer this. She had had months to think about how to answer this. Because I learned something from my Aunt Ruth, she said. The people who love you for your money don't actually love you. I wanted to know who you were without it. Silence. And now I know, she said. Now we both do. He had nothing to say to this. They ended the call. She held the phone for a moment. Then she put it on the dresser and went back to the crib and looked at Rosemary, who was already asleep, one small fist curled against her cheek. I'm not nothing, Claire said softly. I was never nothing. I was just waiting for the right moment to say so. She turned off the amber lamp. She went to bed. She slept well for the first time in a very long time. Rebuilding is not dramatic. This is the thing nobody tells you. It is not a montage. It is not a single morning where you wake up healed. It is smaller than that, more specific, and in some ways, more precious for being so. It is Bev arriving on a Tuesday with takeout and staying for 4 hours and talking about nothing in particular. It is Rosemary's first real smile, not gas, but an actual smile, aimed at the ceiling at 7:30 in the morning, and Claire laughing out loud in the empty kitchen at the sheer unexpectedness of it. It is the night Claire wakes at 2 in the morning and cannot sleep and, instead of spiraling, gets up and makes tea and sits at the kitchen table in the dark and feels, in the silence, something she has not felt in a long time, like herself. Specifically, actually herself, not the self she had been performing for 6 years, the self she was when no one was watching and she was simply making decisions with the whole of her intelligence. She opened the secondary phone. She had been largely absent from the trust's operations for the last 2 months. Pregnancy, labor, the controlled chaos of the early weeks. Lena had been steady. Arthur had held the line. But it was time. She sent Lena a message. Ready to re-engage. Let's set up a review for the end of next week. Lena responded at 7 the next morning. So glad. We've kept everything warm. Have some developments to discuss. The hotel group had a significant offer. Claire read this, set the phone down, picked up her coffee. She was smiling. The social response to Marcus's discovery arrived not in one wave, but in the quiet, persistent way that information moves through a network of people who all know each other. Sandra made the connection first. The Callaway Trust, the antique shop in Pennsylvania, a brief mention in a trade publication from years back that she had half remembered and now, suddenly, fully remembered. She mentioned it at a dinner, careful and oblique, the way people mention things they suspect are significant. By the following Monday, the office knew. Marcus said nothing publicly. He was, by all accounts, managing. He had Noel. He had his position. He had the story he had told everyone, which now needed to be quietly revised without appearing to be revised, which was the most exhausting kind of revision. He did not call Claire again. She did not expect him to. What she did not expect was Diane. Diane called on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the financial disclosure. Claire. Her voice had changed. Something in it that had been comfortable and proprietary was entirely gone. In its place, a careful and almost courtly respect. I've been thinking, and I wanted to call. Hello, Diane. I may have said some things, over the years, that were a pause. I'm not sure I was always as fair to you as I should have been. Claire was in the kitchen. Rosemary was in the bouncer on the table, regarding the world with her characteristic professional attention. The new tulips were yellow on the counter. I appreciate that, Claire said. I didn't know. No, Claire said gently. You didn't. Neither did Marcus. And with respect, Diane, that's rather the point. A very long silence. She's healthy? Diane asked eventually. Rosemary? She's wonderful, Claire said. She has Marcus's eyes. Diane made a sound that was softer than Claire had expected, something with more grief in it. I hope, Diane said, very quietly, that she has your everything else. Claire was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Diane, she said. She meant it, in the way you could mean something that arrived 20 years late. It didn't solve anything. It didn't undo anything. But it was a small truth, offered honestly, and Claire had always had room for those. In early March, she went back to work. Not loudly, not publicly. A meeting with Lena and the Trust's board of advisors in the conference room she had always used, the fourth floor. Good light, good coffee. The kind of room that knew what it was for. They worked through a quarterly review, discussed the hotel offer, updated her on the solar leases, which had expanded into a fourth county and were generating returns that Ruth would have described, in her precise and understated way, as satisfactory. It felt like putting on a coat she had forgotten she owned. It fit perfectly. After the meeting, she stood at the window with her coffee. The city moved below her. It was a Thursday in March, and the sky was that particular pale blue of early spring, tentative, not yet committed to warmth, but present. Lena appeared beside her. Good to have you back, she said. Good to be back, Claire said. For what it's worth. None of us doubted you'd come back stronger. Claire looked at her. What made you so sure? Lena considered. You never seemed afraid, she said. Even when things were complicated. You seemed like someone who knew exactly where they stood. Claire thought about this. I did, she said. I always did. I just wasn't ready to stand there out loud yet. She had finally understood something. The prison door had been unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. Not because she was weak, because she was waiting. Waiting for the moment when standing in the light would cost her nothing. She wasn't already prepared to lose. That moment had come. And it had cost her exactly one marriage she was already grieving. One husband who had never really seen her. 6 years of carefully managed invisibility. She had paid the bill. Now she was free. The Callaway Foundation held its annual spring benefit in early April. It was a modest event by foundation standards. A dinner in a renovated building in the Arts District, attended by the Trust's philanthropic partners, regional board members, and a rotating selection of community organizations the foundation supported. It had taken place every year for 22 years. Ruth had started it. Claire had attended every year since Ruth died, always quietly, always without announcement. This year, for the first time, she was listed as the foundation's director. It was the first public acknowledgement of who she was. She wore a dress that was dark green and well cut. She had Rosemary with her for the first hour, in the arms of a capable and well-compensated babysitter who agreed to take the corner booth near the exit in case the baby needed anything. Rosemary spent the hour looking at the room with her characteristic professional assessment. Bev was there. She looked magnificent and slightly inappropriate in the best way and greeted everyone as though she already knew them, which she mostly did. Arthur was there, in the corner, being exactly as steady and present as Arthur always was. Claire worked the room slowly, the way Ruth had taught her, not performing, just present. She knew several of the foundation's partners personally. She had been managing their grants and contracts for 4 years from a distance, through intermediaries. Meeting them face to face now felt not like an introduction, but like a long overdue recognition. "We've worked together for 2 years," one program director said, shaking her hand. "I never realized it was you directly." "I preferred it that way," Claire said. "For a while. And now?" She smiled. "Now I prefer this." At 7:30, she stood up to speak. She was not nervous. She had Ruth's voice in her head, the clear, quiet certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. "I started coming to this dinner when I was in my mid-20s, she said. The room was quiet, attentive. "My Aunt Ruth brought me. She never told anyone what this event was actually for. She just said, 'These are people doing real work. Come and see.'" She paused. "I spent 20 years learning what real work looks like. Quietly. In rooms nobody covered, with people nobody photographed. And when Ruth passed, she left me the responsibility of continuing that work." She looked around the room. The faces were turned toward her, not because she was impressive, because she was honest. "I have not always done it publicly. That was a choice. But tonight, I want to say this. Whatever we have built, the housing, the infrastructure, the community investments, it was built on the belief that the most powerful thing in a room is not the loudest thing. It is the most consistent thing, the thing that shows up year after year without needing to be seen." She picked up her water glass. "This foundation is that thing. Ruth built it. I intend to keep building it. And so will Rosemary someday when she's ready." She raised her glass slightly. "Thank you," she said, "for doing real work." The room responded warmly, not with the performance of a gala, with something more genuine. The particular warmth of people who had been seen and named. After dinner, she was standing near the windows with a glass of sparkling water when a man she had not met before approached. He was approximately her age. He moved through the room the way people moved who were genuinely interested in where they were rather than who was watching them move through it. He was not performing. "I've been following the Callaway Foundation's work for about 4 years, he said. "Have you?" she said. "The community solar projects in particular. I worked on a related model in the Pacific Northwest. I've always thought Ruth Callaway's approach was ahead of its time." "She was," Claire said. "She is." He heard the present tense. He did not mention it. "Are you carrying that approach forward?" "I'm trying to." He asked her questions. Good questions. The kind that showed he had actually read things and thought about them. He was not performing. He was genuinely interested. "I should check on my daughter," she said eventually. "Of course." He paused. "This might be forward, but there's a project in the region I've been approached about, and after hearing you speak tonight, I think the Callaway Foundation's perspective would be worth a conversation, if you'd be open to a meeting." She looked at him. Owen Gallagher had the kind of face that was not remarkable in individual features, but was, somehow, worth looking at. He was not trying to impress her. He was simply there, asking a genuine question. "Have your office contact Arthur Crane," she said. "He handles my calendar." He smiled, briefly real. "I'll do that." She went to find Rosemary. She did not think, "This is a beginning." She simply went to her daughter and held her, and Rosemary grabbed Claire's finger in her small, determined fist and held on with her characteristic conviction. Claire stood near the windows of the room her aunt had built and looked out at the April night. She felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, like someone standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because of the money, not because of the vindication, because of this. Her daughter in her arms, the trust intact, the work continuing, her own mind fully engaged and finally fully out loud. 3 months later. The morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that turned everything golden. It was the kind of light that only existed for about 20 minutes in the early part of summer. The kind of light that made ordinary things look like they had been chosen carefully. The coffee mug, the yellow tulips, the stack of papers on the corner of the table. Claire was 38 years old and 4 months past the worst thing that had happened to her. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. The good coffee, the kind she bought because she liked it, not because anyone else would notice. Rosemary was in the high chair across the table, negotiating a piece of banana with great seriousness. She had her father's eyes, which was true, and her great-aunt's temperament, which was more important. She approached everything with focused attention, even the banana. "You're going to be formidable," Claire told her. Rosemary looked up. She considered this. Then she returned to the banana. The tulips on the table were yellow. They were always yellow now. It was a small, deliberate continuity. Every 2 weeks, $3 from the same flower stand at the farmer's market. It was the most consistent thing she did. It felt like keeping a promise. On the table beside her, coffee, sat a proposal from Owen's office. It had arrived 2 days ago. She had read it once, the night it arrived, for the feeling of it. Today she would read it again for the decision. The proposal was good. It was, in fact, quite good. A regional infrastructure partnership with community equity components built in from the start. Ruth would have looked at it for a long time and then said, "It's worth a meeting," which from Ruth was very nearly the same as saying, "Yes." Claire reached for her coffee. Her phone showed 3 unread texts from Bev. She had not opened them yet. She knew they would be about brunch, because they were always about brunch. It showed one from Arthur, marked routine, and one from Lena, about the hotel group's completion timeline. The hotel group had accepted a modified offer last week. Lena had handled the final negotiations with a composure that made Claire think, not for the first time, that Lena was going to be extraordinary at this. The phone did not show anything from Marcus. He was, by all accounts, doing adequately. He and Noelle had moved in together. The social recalibration had been, apparently, complicated by the public understanding of exactly what he had walked away from. But he was a resilient man. He would rebuild the story in whatever direction served him best. That was not her concern anymore. It had not been her concern for some time. Rosemary made a sound that was very close to a word. Claire looked at her. What was that? Rosemary did it again. Not quite a word, the architecture of one, the intention. Almost, Claire said. Almost. She opened Bev's texts. The first said, "Brunch Saturday." The second, sent 40 minutes later, said, "Don't say you're busy." The third, sent 90 seconds after that, said, "I will physically come to your house." Claire laughed. She typed back, "Saturday, 11, bring the good pastries." Sent. She set the phone down and looked at her daughter and thought about the morning, about the particular quality of the light, about the fact that in approximately 2 hours she would go to the 4th floor conference room and sit with Lena and 2 members of the Trust's advisory board and work through the second quarter projections. And then in the afternoon, she would come home and take Rosemary to the park, because the weather was exactly right for the park. And in the evening, she would read Owen's proposal again, this time for the decision. This was a Tuesday, a regular Tuesday. This was her life now. She had built this. Not this morning, not in the last 4 months. Over 20 years, quietly, in rooms nobody covered, with a yellow legal pad and a steady hand and the particular patience of a woman who understood that the most powerful things are built slowly and without announcement. Ruth had built it first. Claire was building it further. Rosemary would build it further still. She thought about Marcus for a moment, not with anger, not with grief, with the particular clear-eyed understanding of a woman who had finally seen the whole shape of a thing. He had looked at her for 6 years and seen a woman with nothing. He had been looking at the surface, at the sensible car and the second-hand furniture and the cardigan that belonged to no one important. He had looked at all the careful, deliberate choices she had made to appear ordinary, and he had concluded that she was. He was not a bad man. He was a limited one. He had wanted a woman who reflected his ambitions back to him. He had wanted to be the most impressive person in the marriage. He had arranged his life to make that true, and she had let him, because she was protecting something. She was done protecting it now. She was living it. The hardest part, she thought, wasn't the betrayal. The hardest part was admitting she had known all along, that the signs were there from the beginning, and she had filed them quietly in the part of herself that hoped she was wrong. She hadn't been wrong, but she hadn't been broken by being right either. That was the thing he had miscalculated. He had assumed that leaving her would diminish her, that she would be reduced by his absence, that starting over at 38, alone with an infant, with what he understood to be no resources, would be the devastating consequence of his choice. What he had not understood was that she had been preparing for a beginning, not dreading an ending. What he had not understood was Ruth. What he had not understood was Claire. Rosemary finished the banana with the satisfaction of someone who has completed a significant task. She looked at Claire. "Done?" Claire asked. Rosemary held up both hands. "Very done," Claire agreed. She lifted her daughter out of the high chair and held her against her shoulder and walked to the kitchen window. The morning light was still good. The garden out back was coming in. The rosemary bush by the front steps had survived another winter, as it always did. She stood there for the moment with her daughter and looked at the backyard and thought about nothing in particular. Then she thought about Ruth. She thought, "I hope you can see this. I hope wherever you are, you can see that I'm doing it. The real work, out loud now." She thought, "You spent 40 years building something invisible, and then you handed it to me. And I spent 6 years keeping it invisible too. And now I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it real, making it visible, making it mean something in the world where people can see it. That's what you wanted. I think that's what you always wanted." She pressed her lips to the top of Rosemary's head. Rosemary smelled like the lavender lotion and something warmer underneath. She smelled like herself. "We're going to be okay," Claire said, not because she needed reassurance, because it was true and she wanted to say it out loud. "Both of us, more than okay." She went back to the table, picked up Owen's proposal. She began to read. Some things come to you loudly, with sirens and spectacle and the feeling that the world is ending. There is a crash and a silence, and you are standing in the wreckage, wondering how you got there. And some things come to you quietly, like spring, like your own name spoken for the first time by someone who actually means it, like a morning in your own kitchen with your child and your coffee and your yellow tulips and work that is real and a future that is actually yours. Claire Whitfield had spent 6 years being invisible. She had done it on purpose. She had done it with care. She had learned it from a woman who was wiser than anyone around her ever understood. A woman with sensible shoes and a yellow legal pad, and a 40-year plan that she executed without ever needing anyone to applaud. And in the end, that invisibility had given her everything, not the money. She had always had the money, the knowing, the choosing, the standing in her own life, in her own name, without permission from anyone. He had left because he thought she was poor. She had let him, because she had known, from the first morning she made tea in that kitchen and watched the gray November light come through the window above the sink that he was not leaving her with nothing. He was leaving her with everything. With a daughter named Rosemary, who held on with both hands. With a trust that was doing real work in real places. With a friend who would come to brunch and bring the good pastries without being asked twice. With an attorney who had waited 9 years for the moment he could file a document that was, in his own professional estimation, one of the more satisfying documents of his career. With a proposal on the kitchen table from a man who had asked genuine questions at a foundation dinner and had not once tried to impress her. With spring. With the particular light that only came in the morning in early summer for about 20 minutes, turning everything golden. With a whole life that was, at last, entirely hers. She had been waiting for this, quietly, patiently, without a single unnecessary word, for a very long time. The waiting was over. She turned the page of the proposal. She read, outside, through the kitchen window. The summer morning continued its work. The light shifted and deepened and spread across the table, and the tulips and the top of Rosemary's head and the hands of the woman reading, unhurried, in the warm and quiet of her own life. A life that had always been extraordinary, one that the world was only now beginning to see.
We just watched a woman do something most people never manage in a lifetime. She held her silence, she held her ground, and she held her worth, quietly, completely, without asking anyone to validate it. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because this story is not really about money. It was never about money. The $1.2 billion is just the part that gets your attention, the part that makes the jaw drop, the part that makes a man ask his attorney to repeat himself 3 times in a hallway. But the real story, the one that actually matters, is about a 9-year-old girl who lost her parents and went to live with a woman who wore sensible shoes and drove a truck that needed new shocks. A woman who woke up every morning at 6 and sat at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. A woman who built something real and lasting and invisible, and who, before she left this world, made sure that the person she trusted most understood one thing clearly. That the most powerful thing you can possess is not money. It is not status. It is not the right name or the right address or the right car in the driveway. It is the knowledge of who you are. Deep, certain, unshakable. The kind of knowing that doesn't need to announce itself, that doesn't need to perform, that doesn't need the room to go quiet when you walk in, because it is already quiet, inside you, all the time. Claire Whitfield spent 6 years being invisible by choice. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, because she understood something that Marcus never did. You don't show your hand until the moment it matters, and you never let someone else's underestimation of you become your own. Think about the people in your life who have underestimated you. The ones who looked at your circumstances and drew conclusions. The ones who saw the car you drove and made assumptions. The ones who heard what you did or didn't do and decided that was the whole story. Think about the moments you were told, directly or indirectly, that you were not enough, not ambitious enough, not impressive enough, not the right fit for the life someone else was building. How many of those moments did you internalize? How many did you carry like weight? How many changed the story you told yourself about what you deserved? This is what the story asks you to examine, not the betrayal, not the husband who left, not the dramatic revelation in the attorney's office. The question underneath all of that, do you know your own worth, even when no one around you does? Can you sit in the guest room of your own life, in the quiet, after everything has fallen apart, and still know, with complete and unshaken certainty, that you are not starting over, that you are starting out? Ruth Calloway spent 40 years building something invisible because she understood a truth that most people learn too late. Loud things attract attention, but quiet things build legacies. Loud things make an impression, but consistent things change the world. If you have ever done something good, something real, something lasting, in a room where no one noticed, this story is for you. If you have ever been the person who showed up again and again, without recognition, without applause, because you believed in the work and not the credit, Ruth would have recognized you. Claire would have recognized you. because that is who they were. And if you are still here, still watching,